Hello, students. We are here, I think it's week 7. Sorry, I'm losing a little track, but to discuss Chapter 5. Chapter 5 in our textbook, Discourse, Positioning, and Deconstruction. And so this chapter is a little bit shorter than the last two, and it describes some of the stuff that was talked about in Chapter 7. And so you're going to hear a little bit more about that in detail as you read through this chapter. In addition, this week we have the ASGW, so the Association for Specialist and Group Work article about facilitating conversation in groups. And so I want you guys to check that out as well. So looking at Chapter 5, what it really focuses on is what the discussion sort of in our socio-political climates is, the way that that then has an impact on different individuals and identities, and how we position ourselves within that discourse, and then how deconstruction then is used to break some of that down. And so it has a lot to do with word usage and meaning and stuff like that. And so the concepts that we're going to be talking about in this chapter, it says here, gives us a fresh perspective in the field of culture and on the work that counselors then can do with it. And so there's some kind of practical information for counselors to use. So one of the main reasons that they want to use the concept of discourse is because it often serves as a sharper instrument in which to discuss things that are more problematic to talk about when we use the word culture. And so it gets into a much deeper conversation. And so culture is a blunt instrument because the history of the essentialist thinking is attached to it. Discourse, on the other hand, allows us to capture more of the complexity of the situation in which people often live, as they are pulled in contradictory directions that can never be adequately described by the idea that each person belongs to a single culture. And so it's very easy for us to say, okay, we all kind of come from our own culture based on our intersectional identities and the experiences we've had, but what does that really mean? How does that impact us, and how do we then relate to one another within that? And then the word race is even blunter instrument than culture in this regard, as we've talked about in our chapters about race. And so to the authors of the textbook, the concept of discourse seems uniquely suited as an explanatory framework for making sense of the diversity and complexity of human engagement, which is what multicultural counseling is really all about. And so the discourse is also is always a product of the social world in which we live, which is what we're talking about, right? Which is what we're working with clients, right? Is the social world we're living in. And so thinking in terms of discourse always makes the social, cultural aspects of the problems that people bring to the counselors much more visible. And so we believe that it is in the interest of the intercultural counseling field specifically, and of the counseling profession generally, to re-examine the ways in which people are thought of, problems are diagnosed, and how counseling interventions are conceived. And so again, this chapter is really focusing on what the ways that we as counselors can respond to this, and then what is our part in it? What do we do? So the concept of discourse provides a language to name the social processes that are operating in the client's worlds that are in stark contrast to the essentialist understandings expressed in many models of counseling. So as we talked about already, the models of counseling that we currently view clients from were created by and normed on cis-het white men, which does not obviously fit all of the clientele that we're going to be working with. Use of discourse also provides a way forward in a manner that isn't blameworthy of anyone. It's just, this is the way that we need to move forward in a different direction to address all people, not necessarily placing blame. Deconstruction then lays bare the work done by the discourse, making it visible, and then presenting those opportunities for change and how can we respond to it and do something different. So the chapter starts by talking a little bit more about the term discourse and what discourse is. It's both the process of talk and interaction between people and the products of that interaction. Okay, so it's not just what is said, it's about what that interaction looks like and then what comes of that interaction. The term discourse refers to a set of meanings concepts, images, or statements that produce a particular representation of an event, object, person, or the entirety of the world. Discourse can also be defined as a social practice disseminated through cultural space that exerts a dominating effect on what can be thought or spoken. That is, we speak from a discourse, feel from a discourse, and behave from a discourse. You can get a sense of discourse by listening to any statement that makes and asking yourself, what are the background assumptions on which this statement rests? And so again, it's digging into the deeper meaning. What are all of the meanings that have been attached to this, and what are the beliefs that have been attached to this, and where am I coming from, or where's whoever coming from in discussing this topic? The discourse is not always things that are specifically said out loud, and that, I think, is what is important with this concept, is that everybody within a cultural world, a specific cultural world, that a speaker comes from, knows of those assumptions and thinks of them as normal everyday truth. So it's something that is sort of expected and understood within the culture. And so at any given moment, a variety of discourses will be in circulation in a particular social or cultural world. Discourses can also compete with one another. And so looking at this, one within our class setting, right? And so when we meet for our synchronous sessions and when we're talking on Zoom, we can think of that as like a cultural world and what discourses are at play, right? What are the assumptions and beliefs that we all have as we enter that space? And what discourses can compete with one another. And so they give some examples in the book, like fat is just as beautiful as thin. It is wrong for anybody to be subjected to judgment of her personal wealth on the basis of her body appearance. But when we look at kind of coming together as a class, what are some of the things that come into conflict with one another, right? So like we're not face to face. And so, you know, how much of my behavior or verbalizations need to be seen? I can mute myself, I can turn off my video, things like that. Those things that you would typically do in a class setting, stuff like that. And so the kind of example of us moving the classroom online into a virtual platform kind of brings in a lot of those sort of competing discourses. And so discourses are not simply abstract ideas, ideologies, or theories. They are not as formally constituted as theories. They are, however, implicit social practices that lie just beneath the surface of our understanding and assumptions that are necessary to make what we say and do make sense. So we're definitely not aware of them often. They kind of act under the surface. And so sometimes, even when we're trying to identify what they are, it can be kind of challenging or difficult to get there. And so in this way, discourses construct meaning and shape individuals' behaviors, their perception of the world, and make sense of their lived experience, again, often without our conscious awareness. And so what is the dominant discourse? And so the dominant discourse, as you can imagine, listening to the definition of discourse, what would the dominant discourse be? One of the advantages that the concept of discourse affords is a view of the relationship among competing discourses. The concept of culture is more static and is usually assumed to be more universal and less driven by conflict, whereas different discourses are often quite contradictory, and the one that prevails is the dominant discourse. And so while there are always a range of discourses, they are seldom competing on an even playing level, right? So there's ones that are just kind of coming from a more powerful or influential source, and they tend to become more dominant than others. And so dominant discourse refers to those cultural ideas that have a privileged or dominant influence on our behavior in the world. And it is apparent that some dominant discourses can be very harmful, even though they're the dominant ones. However, many dominant discourses tend to be benign or even helpful in cases. So they are so pervasive in a community that their implications for how life should be lived can often be taken for granted. Again, we don't often think about them, and when we do, sometimes it's hard to really pinpoint what they are because they're just taken for granted. All of these discourses, however, reflect what is often considered common sense about how people should behave and exert a powerful influence in day-to-day interactions. And so, when we think about, people behaving or interacting in ways that wouldn't necessarily be the ways that people should behave and act. And for some reason, probably because I recently watched an episode of The Good Place. And so when I think about The Good Place, there's kind of this social norm about how people are supposed to behave. And there's a character who's not really a person, named Derek, who acts very in opposition to that. And so, just thinking about that character, they obviously are not following the dominant discourses with which we would typically expect. These dominating discourses shape every aspect of human functioning, embracing thought, behavior, and affective responses. And so our feelings are produced out of a world of discourse and culture, such that we do not have some responses that are pure or culture free, right? So all of our responses take into account culture and discourse. Even our dreams have discourse symbols in them, which is not surprising because they often involve language, and language itself comes from those places of culture. So discourse and knowledge. So how does discourse impact our knowledge? One of the aims of modern science has been to establish a body of knowledge that can be relied on for its truth value. The foundation of the system of knowledge creation the academic production of knowledge is built on a set of rules that constitute recognized research methods. These observers are considered neutral or unbiased. The goal of research production within this modern framework is to produce a knowledge of the world of nature. By definition, the world of nature that is free of cultural influence. But that seems to be a bit of a challenge, considering that modern science has tried to eliminate as far as possible the cultural material from the knowledge that it produces. But we've already established that our information and the way we interact in the world and our biases are all based on cultural experiences. And so how do we fully, separate out those things, our knowledge of what is, and how our culture and discourses kind of impact what is in any given, time frame. And so human sciences, like psychology, constructed as they were in a language that everyone believed to separate them, human sciences, like psychology, constructed as they were in language, are full of cultural presuppositions, right? We can't separate them out. And so social scientists are much less able than everyone kind of felt previously to separate themselves from their own cultural perspectives and pursue an objective base of knowledge. And so when we put that on all of the theories that have been created, all of the information from the field of counseling and psychology and human services and social science, basically all of them came from a biased place. And so we have to recognize the context in which all of these theories and theoretical orientations and interventions and everything came from. All of the assessments, the diagnosis, they are not culture free from whoever created them. And so we cannot separate knowledge from the world where discourse operates. Knowledge is constructed out of discourse and for discursive purposes. Knowledge then is a cultural product. Indeed, to know anything is to know it in terms of the discourse. And that's why ultimately it can change over time and location. So facts no longer speak just for themselves. From their conception to the explanation of their significance, they are always interpretations of the world, interpretations made by humans who are imbued with cultural worldviews and are spoken in discourse that embodies the dominant perspective of the specific age, locale, and people from which they're coming. Counseling knowledge is, of course, no exception. It is always built on the discourse of the day. If we look at various theories of counseling and read them as pieces of discourse, they reveal a lot about the cultural worlds inhabited by the people who developed them. And then your text gets a little bit into specifically Freud and Rogers, Freud, of course, being sort of like the father of psychology and psychoanalytic therapy, and Rogers kind of being the father of person-centered or client-centered counseling, and how those theories in and of themselves were really based on the worlds in which Freud and Rogers were experiencing, their own personal biases, culture, and all of that. And so we know that discourse changes over time in response to events and histories throughout encounters of cultural experiences. So we can also expect ideas about counseling to then change in response to that as well. When we look at interculturalism in counseling, the concept of discourse has great importance. It enables us to question the relationships between counseling ideas and the particular cultural worlds occupied by those who speak them. It enables us to examine patterns of cultural dominance in the literature of counseling itself. It enables us, too, to open up the field of counseling to cultural perspectives that are otherwise kept silent by the dominant discourse of the day. And so we can look at other factors that aren't kind of taking precedent, but like kind of like what else are we noticing or kind of seeing happening. Counseling, conversation, and practice contexts are, of course, also conducted in the discourse because they involve language. So talk therapy, right? The ways that clients present problems to the counselor are imbued with discourses of their own, and as are the counselor's response of our own being brought into that space. So then how does discourse and identity work? How do they impact one another? Discourse provides the material out of which we form our identity. Who we are depends on the circumstances we are placed in and the discourses available in the settings we find ourselves in. And so brings up the question, would we be a different person if we were born into a different context or had different experiences? Identity is made up of both personal preferences and cultural specifications for the range within which we are allowed to form those preferences. And so, you know, the time, place, and everything else, it has an impact on who I am as far as my identities, just the same as it might have on a different person in a different time and place. And so in discourse theory, identity is thought of in terms of subjective positions, or subject positions. However, while all discourses offer subject positions that suggest particular ways of being and experiencing the world, they vary in their accessibility and power. The idea that discourse sets up patterns of relationships among people, but rarely has an equal basis. And so Foucault kind of has this quote that the author show here, show people that they are freer than they feel, is his purpose in life, right? So what this means is it's possible to exercise agency more often than people realize. So we feel like we're stuck, we feel like we don't have that freedom, we feel like we don't have that agency, but in reality we have much more than we think. And so in social science there's considerable debate over where to draw the line between the determining effects of social structure and human agency. Agency being the ability to act, to make your own choices, and act within your own beliefs. So people are not necessarily born with limitless agency as of right. Instead, they're born with the capacity for agency, but this capacity remains virtual until it's actualized. As we encounter in our lives the impacts of a variety of social forces. And so in some sort of dominant discourses, it kind of teaches us that we don't have agency in certain ways, or we're kind of pigeonholed into these boxes or things like that. And that ends up stifling some of the agency that we would sort of automatically innately have. And so agency on one's own behalf, however, is a more of a product than a right. And so based on the discourses and the cultural customs in which we live, that produces more of a sense of agency in some people and less of a sense of agency in other. And so it is possible to exercise agency much more than people realize, because we're kind of feeling bound by these restrictions of culture and dominant discourse. And so discourse practices are so ordinary and everyday that they often slip by unnoticed because they're just what everyone expects. And so we have to be able to recognize them so that we can push forward past them. These workings of discourse are the very material that makes up culture. They are also the material that makes up people's identities, right? Getting back to the idea of discourse and identities. And so for counseling, the work that discourse does in the construction of a person's problems in their life is very important, because if the material that makes up people's identities is related to the workings of discourse within our culture and within our experiences, then that discourse that's happening within the counseling session really is very important in helping us to feel good about our identities and taking on identities that are congruent with who we are. So there's the sense in which counselors who are working with clients about personal struggles are always working with the cultural dimensions of life, which moves us into positioning. The concept of positioning is built on the concept of discourse. It can serve as a bridge between the personal and the social aspects of discourse. It is a metaphor used to describe the fluid and dynamic relationship between people and discourse. So as I said, like in the counseling relationship, the client is coming with a specific discourse and we're coming in with a different one. And what is important in counseling is that relationship, right, between me and the client. And so what impact do those discourses kind of working between each other, how does that then have an impact? And so positioning refers to the way in which every utterance of a conversation establishes, even for a moment, a relation that is made up of discourse and discursive assumptions. In this moment, a speaker establishes a position for themselves in relation to their set of meanings, including identity meanings. And they also position other people in a place of meaning for which they are invited to respond. A conversation is then made up of a series of position-taking utterances that install moments of moral oughtness based on particular discourses. Each utterance also issues a position call to listeners. It calls them into a position from which to respond. In this way, positioning enables us to examine the influence of discourse on individuals' lives and how they come to take up certain identities and not others. So the discursive concept of positioning has only recently begun to be described within the counseling literature, despite the potential it holds for culturally and socially responsible work. And so what they're saying is that in order to be culturally and socially responsible, we need to pay attention to the ways in which these discourses are working within our relationship. The concept of discourse is inadequate without incorporating the concept of positioning. Positioning points to the manner in which individuals are located in the conversations as active participants in producing what they experience. So discourses are manifest in how we go forward in our therapeutic engagements. Discourses make available particular subjective positions. And so how do we see the world? How do we be in the world? That when taken up have particular implications for our own subjectivity and experiences. In emphasizing the subjectivity that is produced through the positions we take up, the concept of positioning helps direct attention to the dynamic aspects of interactions and prevents static and fixed understanding of discourse. It's constantly changing and growing and adapting. The discursive field within which people live inevitably provides some degree of subjectivity and thus an agentic position. The emphasis on the subjective, as opposed to subjected, quality of positioning permits individuals to exercise choice in relation to the discourses available. And so we don't have to buy into the dominant discourse. We can choose what discourse we feel like we need to accept or engage in. The power of dominant discourses is not absolute, and invitations to take up certain positions in the discourse can be accepted or rejected. So we can choose whether or not we accept the dominant discourse or we reject it and buy into something else. Positioning also allows room to actively engage with the discourses in a way that is quite liberating. So I don't have to just kind of follow along with the dominant discourse. I can really engage with it and make decisions based on it. And so disrupting the dominant discourses open up spaces for competing discourses in which alternative ways of being can be constructed. There are discourses that do not typically bear such dominant and oppressive influences in people's interactions. These alternative discourses challenge the more dominant discourses and often representative of marginalized cultural ideas, circulating within a context or a community. And so one example that they give is husband and wives are equally suited for economic and domestic activities, right? And so we don't have to go with that dominant discourse of like, wives are responsible for the domestic activities and husbands are responsible for the economic activities within a family. We can say that there are other things, other discourses that we can engage in instead of that dominant one. Your textbook goes on to talk about more examples of positioning, and it gives you a little, two little case studies to look at. The importance and practical value of dynamic concept of discourse and positioning cannot be overestimated. The advantage of taking up these conceptual tools is that it provides counselors with a way to keep cultural backdrop of contemporary life visible and invites clients to think and be otherwise, which is extremely freeing for them. So they don't have to feel, as trapped in whatever it is that they're experiencing. They can look at something differently. They can view it differently. They can be in it differently. And sometimes that's enough to help a client kind of, get themselves out of that hole, that stuckness in which they may be bringing to the process. The advantage, examination of the discourses and positions available to therapists and clients help work toward taking up positions and discourses that are less personally damaging to the individual. Just having that understanding that this is not something that I have to engage in. And so one of the things that's coming up for me is with religion and sexual affectional orientation. And so the dominant discourse within, many religious organizations is that it is sinful or should be hidden or ignored or whatever, and people are not to act out on it. And that dominant discourse is painful, it is harmful, it is damaging and destructive, and can be violent towards the individual experiencing it. And recognizing that they maybe have this connection to their religious organization and also their identity as an LGBTQ+ individual. And so how do I make sense of that? Well, it's recognizing that there are other discourses that could be present. I can both have a faith or belief in, my God or, my faith in some way, and also recognize that this dominant discourse is coming from people. And that my discourse, where it comes to religion and my sexual affectional orientation and identity, don't have to be in conflict with one another. I can identify discourses where they're not. And so, example. So, getting into the third concept of this chapter, deconstruction. So one feature of discourse is that it often works right under our noses without us noticing. And so it's more the surface evidence that is often being overlooked because it is sort of so obvious that we don't fully see it. And sometimes it takes effort to uncover the work being done by the discourses kind of behind our backs or behind the scenes. And so the process by which discourses and positions are unpacked is called deconstruction. So how do we deconstruct these dominant discourses and the positioning with which we find ourselves to look for something else? So deconstruction refers to the practice of exploring and uncovering the taken for granted assumptions and influential discourses that underpin our conversations, our behaviors, and our emotional expression. We need to know what it is. We need to uncover it so that we can then deconstruct it. So the use of a word is always bound with a social and linguistic context and carries with it the many other uses of the concept and thousands of other conversations that have taken place in the history of language. And so again, I'm going to look at the LGBTQ community and take a look at the word queer. And so historically, queer just meant different or strange or unique. But over this dominant discourse, the word queer came to be a derogatory term towards individuals who are something other than heterosexual, the norm, right? And so it became a slang term that was used in a pejorative way to harm or to hurt an entire group of people. However, as time has gone on, that word queer has been reclaimed by the community as, you know what, like, I don't fit into that norm, that dominant discourse, and that's okay. We need to deconstruct that dominant discourse and the positioning with which I've been placed within it, and break it down into something different. And then the term queer was able to be kind of recaptured and mean something completely different today. Again, it can be used in a harmful way. I want to kind of clarify that depending on the person saying it and in the context, it can be still used in a harmful way, but it's sort of being reclaimed. A word or meaning echoes down a long corridor of voices is one of the quotes in the book. And so, you know, it kind of takes on shape as it passes through that corridor. Another thing to take a look at is this idea that there are some things that cannot be deconstructed. And so if anything is deconstructible, it is justice. Deconstruction aims to break up rigidities of thoughts, particularly where they have oppressive consequences, to open up a field of inquiry to previously unnoticed possibilities. It achieves this by disassembling pieces of the discourse that are actually constructions that pose as natural truths. And so in the modern world, natural truths are regularly accorded to the highest form of truth status. And so another example is when we look at race. And so when we think about the time after slavery was abolished, and then through, you know, Jim Crow and the Civil Rights era, and kind of following that time frame into, you know, the 80s and 90s and stuff, there was sort of this dominant discourse that, and I'm going to specifically talk about Black individuals in our country, that the more you fit into that dominant culture, that dominant discourse, the better off you were. And so, you know, don't wear your hair naturally. Don't wear, you know, ethnic or cultural clothing or jewelry. Conform your language and your accent and the way that you speak to this other thing. But at a certain point, that needed to be deconstructed so that people can say, like, no, what is natural is my natural hair, and I can connect with the cultures that my ancestors have come from, or, you know, other things like that. And so recognizing that just because it is that, like, dominant discourse, the dominant culture, it doesn't mean that everyone has to buy into it. We can kind of break it down and say, but is that really healthy for everyone? What else can we be doing? And so this one philosopher, Derrida, is talked about in this chapter, talks about this specific method for deconstruction. And so identify the conceptual construction of particular discourse, identify the conceptual pairs that make up the polarized options for thought around which that discourse is organized. And so, like, male is not female, light is not dark, educated is not illiterate, white is not Black, etc. Play into that binary pairing and invert it so that the normally subordinated meaning is privileged. And so what would it be like if Black were the privileged meaning, right? So kind of throw it on its head. And then search for a surplus meaning. What is a third, fourth possible meaning that may have escaped our attention when we're looking at this binary solely? So the concept of deconstruction is relevant for counseling because counselors, like literary critics, are vitally interested in carefully making meaning of the things that their clients tell them. And so clients are frequently caught in binary oppositions, right? So, like, if I'm not with this person, then I'm completely alone by myself. If this thing doesn't happen, then I have nothing, right? And so, like, kind of looking at those binary ways of thinking and helping them to deconstruct that a bit. And so clients are also living in circumstances prescribed within discourses that divide the world in binary ways anyway. And so that just kind of adds another layer to it. And so helping people overwhelmed by the effects of that rigid discourse in their lives to identify how things could be otherwise. And so using the term deconstruction, or the term deconstruction has been used to refer to the process of therapeutic inquiry in which the counseling aims to subvert taken for granted realities and practices, and by rendering them strange. The use of deconstruction in counseling involves a tentative, curious, deliberately naive posture. And so I talk about a lot with my supervisees and the internship and practicum students about being curious. And so I think that this really defines like what I mean by that. And so when a client's talking to you about something, you know, could you ask, what was left out? What was covered over? What was paid attention to and what was not? And so you can ask them like, well, what about this aspect of it? Or, you know, what was something that you might have missed there? Or how might somebody else look at that or see that? And so you kind of take different ways to really break down the situation and help the client to start to deconstruct that. So counseling from a discursive perspective focuses on the contextual staging of problems rather than on essentialist aims such as personality change or symptom removal, okay? It is less preoccupied with seeking definitive and objective answers. So it's not like client has a problem, here you go, here's the answer, here's the solution, I'm just gonna tie it up nicely in a bow and hand it to you, because that's not how it works and that's not what counseling is designed to do. Clients are themselves invited to engage in the deconstruction process that challenges the ways in which cultural systems maintain the status quo. So how do we break down that status quo and make changes where they need to? Deconstructive questioning asks where these meanings come from, who they benefit, and what discourse grants them authority, and what other preferences or competencies they mask. And so the sort of binary thinking that a client might be doing on a specific thing, where are those shoulds and oughts coming from? What place do they serve? Who do they serve? And what impact are they having on the client? The practice of deconstruction is differentiated from other forms of counseling in that it appreciates fully the extent to which people are seduced by culture and its imperatives to behave in a certain way. Deconstruction rather suggests that the world of culture is always riven with contested meanings, and the dominant meanings are not necessarily optimal for all people, or really even maybe any of us. Deconstructive analysis of particular discourse usage opens up choice and frees up position taking that could be possible instead of staying in this place where I'm put and I'm mandated, but being able to see the other open possibilities. Again, another thing that I like about this chapter is it goes into deconstructing identity stories. So just kind of looking at examples of it and seeing how it sort of plays out in specific people's situations. And so using these tools have potential for opening up the tensions and contradictions within cultural worlds, as well as the consistencies and commonalities, because we don't want to forget those. They enable us to understand the processes of change, and since counseling is about the facilitation of change, we believe that this is an important advantage of it. However, the process of change in relation to dominant discourse will necessarily encounter obstacles. Dominant discourses, by their nature, seek to remain in positions of dominance. And so it's not going to be having this conversation once with your client. They're like, yep, makes sense, clicked, we're good, moving on. But continuing to reinforce that in them and help them continue to practice that. And so intercultural counselors need to develop an analysis of how power works, and that is a and that's something we're going to get into in the next chapter, but recognizing how the power works within those systems from which the client is presenting, so that you can then help them to recognize that as well. And so again, that's going to be what we get back into. We're going to go next week into some stuff from the Counselor for Social Justice text. I have those chapters linked up on in the module section, and then we'll get back into power and privilege in our next section. So this chapter ends in an exercise in deconstructing dominant discourse with 2 individuals, and then the response to chapter 5 by an individual, and they get a little bit into power and privilege as well ahead of the next chapter. And so again, what I really liked about this chapter is it's, I think, really practical. It helps us to understand a little bit more about what this looks like in the counseling setting and what we can do with this knowledge to help our clients a little bit better. And so you will see me again when I come back to talk about the Counseling for Social Justice 6 and 7 for next week. And also, I just want to remind you to take a look at that ASGW article. I think it's really great the way it's outlined, you know, very specific things to do in groups. It doesn't have to be counseling groups. It can be any group at all, ways of discussing difficult topics and transforming hate. And so really, really great article, really great to look at. And that is it for this week. So thank you.